air was a blade-sharp and relentless carving through the vast, desolate expanse of the Nevada frontier. It was late winter, and the cold wasn't merely a sensation. It was a living entity, a predatory force that gnawed at the very marrow of one's bones, turning breath into visible plumes of ephemeral smoke. The landscape itself seemed to recoil from its embrace, a dry basin clawed at by the wind stretching endlessly under a sky that sat low and colorless, a dull slab of iron pressed against the jagged peaks of the mountains. Silas, at 36, stood on the edge of his cabin porch, one booted foot resting on the weathered wood. His arms were laden with kindling split the day before, each piece a testament to his solitary existence. There was no urgency in his movements, no hurried pace to dictate his day. His life had shed such demands long ago. He lived alone by choice, a deliberate retreat from a world that had with brutal efficiency stripped him of what he held dear. A younger brother lost to the distant bloody fields of war. A woman, Marie, whom he had nearly wed, snatched away by a merciless fever in Illinois. After such losses, the very notion of rebuilding, of reaching for connection, had withered within him. 2 winters had passed since he'd raised this cabin hauling lumber from the ridge, a self-imposed exile from the nearest town which he hadn't seen in over a month. Food traps, firewood, these were the simple, sufficient anchors of his days. He was halfway to the woodpile, the familiar crunch of frozen earth beneath his boots, when an anomaly snagged his attention. A shape slumped beside the pile. Not an animal. Too still, too profoundly human. A jolt of caution, cold and sharp, pierced through him. The basin rarely yielded visitors, and those it did were usually driven by desperation or shadowed by danger. He lowered the kindling slowly, deliberately, his hands falling loose near his belt, not yet reaching for the rifle that leaned just inside the cabin door. She lay on her side in the snow, barely covered. Her body, half frozen, was curled inward, one arm tucked close as if seeking to shield herself from the biting wind. Her feet, bare and raw, were a grotesque mosaic of purple and cracked skin open at the soles. Strong, thick legs, scraped and bruised, were starkly visible through a long tear that had ripped her skirt wide open from thigh to hip. Her dress deerskin was a patchwork of styles, worn thin and meticulously mended, yet its neckline was perilously low for the brutal winter. Her breasts, full and strained against the frozen leather, rose and fell with shallow, desperate breaths. Dark hair, loose and wild, clung to her cheeks where ice had formed delicate, cruel patterns. A few strands were tangled with beads and a single solitary feather. Her face was flushed with the brutal cold, her mouth chapped and broken. But her eyes, black wide and unnervingly steady, were fixed on him. There were no tears, no frantic blinks, just a silent, unwavering gaze. Every fiber of Silas's being tensed, not in fear, not precisely, but in something older, a primal caution. The woman did not look helpless, yet she made no move, no sound. She simply lay there, teetering on the precipice of death, and waited. He didn't ask who she was. Not yet. The question, though pressing, felt secondary to the stark reality of her plight. Instead, he moved a quiet, deliberate shift and knelt beside her, one knee crunching loudly in the snow. Her skin, where exposed, was frigid beneath the coat of frost, the heat from her body almost entirely extinguished. She was dying, and if he left her, she would be gone before the sun fully cleared the eastern peaks. He hesitated, a fleeting moment of internal debate. He possessed only one coat. It was the same one he had carried through the war, a thick olive gray wool, its buttons worn smooth, its military stitching a faded memory. He had patched it a dozen times, slept in it through blizzards, dug graves in its protective embrace. It was an extension of himself, his last tangible link to a past he rarely acknowledged. It was all he had. Still kneeling, Silas slipped his arms from the sleeves, the wool cool against his skin, and lifted the coat off his shoulders. He unfolded it, the heavy fabric rustling, and carefully draped it across the woman's body, wrapping it around her upper half first, then tucking it beneath her legs. The coat, so vast on his frame, swallowed her slender form, its hem dragging through the snow, its broad shoulders loose over her own. It was all he could offer. She said not a single word. He shifted, gathering her weight, one arm sliding beneath her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. Her skin felt like stone, shockingly cold against his touch. She was heavier than she appeared, full-bodied, solid, not fragile but utterly limp, completely surrendered to his care. He grunted softly as he rose, holding her close. Her head fell against his shoulder, her bare legs swinging slightly as he turned and walked quickly back toward the cabin, the urgency of the moment eclipsing all other thoughts. Inside, the fire had dwindled to a faint glow. He gently set her down on the buffalo hide laid out by the hearth. The warmth from the embers was faint, but it was a start. He tossed 2 logs onto the coals, blowing steadily, until a flame caught, then another. As the fire flared, orange light filled the small single-room cabin, illuminating her face, her bare shoulders, the top of her chest where the coat had fallen open slightly. Her skin was flushed from exposure, her lips pale but no longer dry now that the wind's cruel kiss was gone. She watched him unmoving, still silent. He turned away, went to the wash basin, and returned with a tin of warmed water and a clean cloth. He sat down beside her, carefully took one of her ruined feet in his hand, and began wiping it gently. He had seen frostbite before. This wasn't quite that, not yet, but it was perilously close. He cleaned the wounds with meticulous care, his thick fingers moving slow and precise, a surprising tenderness in their touch. He wrapped her feet in clean strips of cotton, not tight, just enough to protect the cracked skin. She winced once, a fleeting flicker of pain, and that was all. The coat shifted slightly as she moved, and he caught a fleeting glimpse of her hip, the soft curve where the dress had torn entirely. He looked away swiftly, not out of shame, but because it felt too intimate, like seeing something that had not been offered, a vulnerability too raw for casual observation. Once her feet were wrapped and her body still again, he went to the stove and ladled out the last of the rabbit stew he had made 2 nights ago. He brought the bowl to her and held it out. She hesitated for a second, her gaze meeting. His then slowly raised her hand, took the bowl, and began to eat in slow, steady bites. Still not a word. Silas sat on the edge of his cot across the room and watched her. The fire crackled softly, a comforting counterpoint to the storm that pressed against the cabin walls. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote howled, a lonely, mournful sound. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she was out here barefoot in the snow, dressed as if for a summer hunt, not the dead of winter. She didn't look like she had escaped something. No bindings on her wrists, no brand marks, just a thin scar on one shoulder, long healed, and those eyes that watched him without fear. Silas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and let out a slow breath. He didn't know what she would bring into his life, but he hadn't left her out there. That had to count for something. The fire held steady through the long night, snapping and spitting now and then, but otherwise the cabin was silent. Silas hadn't slept. He had leaned back in the single wooden chair near the hearth, arms crossed, boots planted firm on the floor, his eyes fixed on the woman lying beneath his coat. She hadn't uttered a single word, not when she finished the stew, not when he set out a folded quilt and turned away so she could pull it over herself. Not even when he offered her water and she took the cup from his hands with fingers still trembling from the cold. She was there, a palpable presence, yet quiet, in a way that didn't feel weak. She was aware. She watched everything, even in stillness. He wasn't sure what to make of that yet. Now, as the dim gray light of morning bled through the cracks in the shutters, Silas leaned forward. His legs were stiff from staying seated so long, his back ached with the unaccustomed stillness. He rolled his shoulders out with a soft grunt and rubbed at the back of his neck. Then his eyes flicked to the floor again. She hadn't moved all night, but she was awake. He could tell. He stood and stoked the fire again, then walked to the stove and filled the kettle. It was a routine he could perform: blind heat water, grind bean stew meat from the night before. But there was something unfamiliar in the way he moved that morning, as if the silence wasn't just his own anymore. He glanced back. The woman was sitting up now. She had the coat wrapped around her again, the collar pulled close around her neck, but gaping open just enough to show the curve of her chest, the broken dress beneath. Her legs were drawn up beneath her, and her dark hair was half loose from its braid falling over one shoulder. Her dark eyes were still on him. He nodded once. She didn't nod back, but she didn't look away either. Caleb went to the cabinet and brought out a flannel shirt of his old, patched but clean. He set it on the table beside a fresh piece of bread and a tin cup of water. Then he stepped back, giving her room. "You can stay," he said, his voice low, gravelly thick from disuse. "If you want." She didn't answer, but after a long pause she stood slowly, carefully, and walked to the table. She moved like someone accustomed to pain, not dramatically, not weakly, just with a steady, enduring grace. When she reached for the bread, the coat shifted off one shoulder, revealing a jagged scar that curved from her collarbone down to her shoulder blade. Caleb noticed it, didn't stare, just filed it away. He spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Quiet now. You got a name?" The woman chewed the bread slowly, then drank from the cup. A long moment passed before she finally said River. Her voice was dry, hoarse, but clear. Caleb nodded. River. That was all they said, but it was something. As the morning wore on, she remained by the fire while he worked. He stepped out briefly to bring in more wood, glancing back at the cabin twice before shutting the door each time. He didn't know if she would stay. He wasn't sure why he cared, but he did. By noon, the sun had shone just enough to melt the frost from the windows, casting weak, pale light into the cabin. He set a basin near the stove, filled it with hot water, and placed a clean cloth beside it. Then he walked over and crouched near her again. "I heated some water," he said. "You can clean up if you want." She studied him, her dark eyes searching his face, then looked toward the basin. After a pause, she nodded once. He stood. "I'll be outside for a while. Holler if you need something." She didn't answer, but as he stepped toward the door, he heard the soft rustle of the coat falling to the floorboards. He didn't look back. Outside, the wind had eased some. The sky remained overcast, but the biting edge of the cold had dulled. He chopped to keep busy, splitting log after log, his muscles working on memory. But his mind wasn't quiet. She hadn't explained why she was there, where she'd come from, who might be looking for her, whether she'd been cast out or escaped something worse. The scar, the bare feet, the torn dress. These were questions that lingered, unspoken yet present. Still, he knew what it looked like when someone wanted to run and River didn't seem like she was planning to. Not yet. By the time he returned inside, the cabin was warm with steam. The basin had been emptied. The flannel shirt he'd left was now on her frame, hanging loose, sleeves rolled but worn like it belonged. She had laid the coat carefully across the edge of the cot, folded like something sacred. She turned when he stepped inside. Her face was clean now, the cracked skin around her lips softened with moisture. Her eyes were less guarded, but still silent, still sharp. She pointed to the stove. "I can cook." It was the first full sentence she'd offered. Caleb nodded. "All right." He didn't smile, but he didn't stop her either. By dusk, she had lit a lamp and was stirring what was left of the stew with steady, capable hands. Caleb sat at the table, watching the fire flicker across the walls. He could smell soap on the air. He noticed how her braid had been redone tighter, more purposeful. Her movements were slower, more deliberate now. She had taken up space not loudly or boldly, but with a quiet certainty. He realized without meaning to that he had placed 2 plates on the table instead of 1. She noticed too. She brought the food over, sat across from him, and for the first time since she arrived, she didn't watch him with weary silence. She just ate and stayed. The next morning came without fanfare, just cold light slipping through the cracks in the shutters and the low, steady creak of roof timbers contracting in the frost. Caleb arose before sunrise, as he always did, sliding quietly from the cot so as not to wake her. River lay on the buffalo hide close to the fire, curled in the thick quilt he'd given her. The flannel shirt hung from her frame, the hem reaching her thighs, and one bare leg had slipped out as she slept. The scar on her shoulder was visible again in the warm light of the coals. It looked more deliberate, clean ceremonially, even not from a knife fight, not from a beating. That realization planted a new question in Caleb's mind, though he said nothing, just watched her a moment longer before stepping outside. The air bit hard again. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, dusting the ground, but not enough to slow him. He checked the trap's 2 rabbits. One sprung empty, and returned with them slung in his hand by mid-morning. He cleaned them behind the cabin. His hands practiced his movements, silent. He liked silence. Silence didn't ask questions. But this morning his mind wasn't quiet. Inside the cabin had already changed. The basin was emptied and cleaned. The mugs had been washed and stacked. The shirts he'd worn for days were hanging near the fire, drying neatly, after what must have been a thorough scrubbing. And there she was, standing at the stove, barefoot, but steady, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, hair tied back in a tight braid with the same old leather cord. She didn't look up when he entered, just said, "Water's hot. I can make coffee." Caleb shut the door, stepped out of his boots, and placed the rabbits on the table. "You didn't have to do all that." She paused only a moment. "I know." The words were simple, but they weren't defensive. They were a choice. She wasn't trying to repay him. She was simply acting like she belonged there. It didn't sit wrong with him. He poured water into the tin kettle and set it to boil while she kept working, clearing the ashes from the firebox, cutting up potatoes from his dwindling winter store. He caught himself watching the way her hips moved under the shirt when she bent, the fabric rising just enough to show where her thigh met the hem. She wore no underthings. He looked away before his eyes lingered too long. When they sat to eat, he finally asked the question that had been growing since the first night. "Where were you going?" She didn't look up. "Nowhere. You run from someone." "No," she said. Then after a beat, "They let me go." He frowned slightly. Why, River's eyes lifted, meeting his. They were dark, steady, holding a depth of sorrow that resonated with his own. "They said I was no good. A woman who cannot give a child is not wanted in my band." That silenced him. She didn't sound angry. Didn't sound ashamed either. Just matter of fact, as if she'd already made peace with it, or at least buried it deep enough not to shake anymore. He shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "They just sent you out there in the snow like that?" She nodded. "I did not beg." He studied her a moment longer. Her jaw was strong, shoulders set. She wasn't trying to earn his pity. She was telling him the truth and trusting him not to throw it back in her face. He respected that more than he could put into words. He chewed the rest of his food quietly. Then he rose and moved to the corner where his gear was kept. He opened a cedar chest and pulled out a pair of thick socks and a second flannel shirt, less worn but still too large for her. He handed them over. "For you," he said. She took the shirt, first looked it over, then touched the socks, feeling their thickness in the toe. When she looked up at him, she didn't smile, but something softened in her expression, a flicker of gratitude that warmed the air between them. "Thank you." It was the first time she'd said that. Later, when the sun was higher, she followed him outside. He hadn't asked her to, but when he stepped onto the porch to split firewood, she was already pulling the coat over her shoulders and stepping barefoot onto the cold ground. "You'll freeze," he warned, half turning. "I've felt worse," she said, her voice flat, devoid of complaint. He handed her a pair of old work gloves. She took them and began stacking the chopped logs in the sled by the cabin wall. Wordless, focused, efficient. She didn't move like someone coddled or helpless. She moved like someone who had carried heavy things before and learned not to complain about it. That made him respect her even more. They worked in tandem for hours. He split. She stacked. When the sled was full, she helped him drag it back around the house. Neither of them said much, but it wasn't awkward. The silence between them was starting to feel less like absence, and more like understanding a shared rhythm that needed no words. That night, she sat closer to the fire than before. He noticed she'd rolled his socks to her knees under the shirt and pulled the sleeves of the new flannel tight at the wrists. The coat, once draped over her like a shield, now lay folded at the foot of the bed untouched. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'm warm here," she replied, her voice soft but firm. Still, when he lay down later, he noticed her glancing toward him. Just once, not yearning, not unsure, just quietly observing. And when he turned to the wall, eyes half closed, he heard the quilt rustle. Faint footfalls on the wood floor. She wasn't coming to join him, but she was moving closer. A moment later, she lay down on the floor just beside his bed, no longer by the fire. That was all. She didn't ask for permission, and he didn't stop her. She was staying for now. That was enough. The snow fell heavier that night, muting the sounds outside, and wrapping the land in a kind of stillness only deep winter could bring. Caleb barely noticed. He was wide awake, lying on his back beneath the heavy quilt, listening to the faint creak of the roof timbers and the shallow rhythm of River's breathing just below him, close on the floor beside his bed. She hadn't spoken when she moved there, hadn't asked, just picked up the quilt from the hearth, folded it over her shoulders, and lay down next to him like it was the natural thing to do. And maybe it was. He'd spent years alone out here. Years where no one shared his warmth or his food or his floor. But now there was a woman at arm's length. A woman who hadn't asked for anything and yet stayed. He didn't sleep easily, not because of distrust, but because of everything unspoken between them. He didn't know what had truly happened to her out there before she collapsed near his woodpile. Her story was still full of holes: where she'd come from, who she'd left behind, how far she had walked in the cold, and whether someone might still be looking for her. But he knew enough to recognize the look in her eyes when she first arrived. It was the same look he saw in his own reflection years ago after the war. After the fever took Marie, after his brother's letter came back, Mark killed in action. That look didn't ask for help. It simply wanted not to be turned away. In the morning he rose early, quietly pulling on his trousers and boots. The stove was cold and the inside of the windows were fogged with frost. He stepped outside to fetch more kindling. When he returned, she was already up. The floor was cleared. The blankets were folded and she stood near the stove. Shirt sleeves rolled high, skin flush from rubbing her face clean with snow water. Her braid had come undone in the night, and her hair now hung long and wild, curling at the ends from the heat. She laid out a pan, filled it with the last of the meal, and was flattening biscuits by hand. "You slept?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She didn't look up. Enough. He watched her in the firelight as she moved the hem of the flannel shirt, just brushing her thighs. She didn't bother with the coat anymore. The socks still reached her knees. The scar on her shoulder, the one he hadn't asked about again, was visible each time she reached for the skillet. She noticed him watching, but she didn't turn away. "I was a wife once," she said, almost offhandedly, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Ethan blinked. It was the first she'd spoken of it. "I was 16. He was older. No children came. After 3 winters, they called me cursed. The medicine woman said I brought sickness to his blood, so they told me to leave. He waited, letting the silence fill the weight of her words settling between them before asking, "And you just did?" She nodded. "Better to leave than to watch them wait for me to fail again." He said nothing. There wasn't anything to say. It wasn't pity he felt. It was something heavier, a recognition, a kind of shared ruin neither of them had asked for but both had lived through. "You were married?" she asked. After a while, her voice softer, a hint of curiosity. He gave a slight nod. "Almost. We had a ring, picked a date. Then she took sick. Took 4 days to go. She didn't offer comfort. Didn't say sorry. Just turned the biscuit in the pan. And somehow that was enough. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He just needed her to know." They ate in silence, a new layer of understanding woven into the quiet. Afterward, they worked together. She shoveled snow from the path while he hauled wood. When he went to repair the barn latch, she came without asking and held the board steady while he hammered. Her hands were rougher than he expected, worn from years of labor but precise. Later inside, she mended his shirts with thread he hadn't used since his mother died. She didn't ask permission. She just found the basket, sorted the torn ones, and started sewing by the fire, lips slightly parted in concentration, her brow furrowed just enough to crease between the eyes. He found himself watching again. Not just her body, but how it moved in his space. How she'd taken to wiping the table clean with a wet cloth after meals. How she folded his shirts before placing them near the bed. How the coat he'd once given her now hung on the same wall peg as his hat. She'd never asked to stay, but she was already here. That night after the fire burned low and the cabin dimmed to ember light, she stood from her spot near the hearth and walked toward the bed. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the quilt from the floor and without a word, slipped beneath the covers beside him. Her body was warm, a radiating heat that seeped into him. Bare skin touched his chest beneath the flannel. She still wore his shirt, but he could feel her shape through it. Soft curves pressed to his side, her thigh resting against his. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. For a moment, his heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Her hand found his slow, tentative, a feather-light touch that sent shivers through him. Then her voice came close to his neck, dry but steady, resonating with a profound honesty. "You gave me warmth. You gave me food. You didn't ask anything back." She leaned in, her lips brushing his collarbone as she whispered, "If you want, I'll be your wife now. Not out of pity. I will stay because I choose to." He turned toward her, then his heart heavy in his chest, a mix of awe and a fragile hope he hadn't dared to entertain. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just pulled her in closer, his arms wrapping around her, and she melted into his embrace. The fire had died to coals by the time the sky began to lighten through the shutters. A thin line of pale dawn leaked between the boards, tracing across the bed where Ethan lay still, his arm resting over Willow's waist. Her body was turned inward to his, nestled against him. She hadn't moved all night. Neither had he. He wasn't used to the weight of another person in his bed, let alone the kind of quiet warmth that wasn't born of obligation or lust. Her presence wasn't demanding. She hadn't clung to him, but she also hadn't pulled away. Her breath was soft against his chest, her hands still resting beneath the flannel shirt she wore tucked against his ribs, like she was holding on to a certainty she'd never had. Ethan's eyes opened slowly. He didn't speak. He just listened to the sound of her breathing, to the creaks in the timbers above, to the wind outside that had calmed overnight. Something about the silence between them had shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It held weight, a comfortable, profound presence. When Willow finally stirred, her brow furrowed briefly as she adjusted to the faint light. She blinked, then met his eyes. No smile, no surprise, just quiet understanding, a deep well of shared experience. She'd made a decision the night before, and she hadn't changed her mind by morning. Ethan brushed his thumb over the side of her face. Rough skin, wine-chapped, yet soft beneath his touch. Her eyes didn't close, but she leaned into it just a little. "Still want to stay?" he asked. Quietly, his voice a low rumble. Her voice came back without hesitation, clear and firm. "Yes." She sat up, pulling the quilt with her. The shirt rumpled and fell off one shoulder. Her body was bare beneath it. He could tell, but she moved without shame, without self-consciousness. She reached for the coat that hung near the wall and wrapped it loosely around her before stepping barefoot to the stove. She poured water into the tin pot without asking, lit a match, and set the kettle to boil. That was the moment Ethan realized she wasn't a guest anymore. She was home. While the coffee warmed, he pulled on his trousers and a heavy undershirt, then stepped outside to check on the livestock. Snow still covered much of the ground, but patches of earth had begun to show beneath the eaves of the barn where the melt had already started. It would be spring soon. He cleared the troughs, checked the fencing, and reset the traps he'd left the day before. His body moved automatically, but his thoughts stayed back inside the cabin. On her, on what it meant now that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. By the time he returned, the smell of coffee and fresh bread greeted him at the door. Willow was seated at the table, her hair wet and streaming down her back, having clearly washed in the basin while he was gone. She wore the same flannel shirt, but she'd belted it now with a strip of leather. It clung differently, her curves showing more clearly. She looked present, anchored. He set the bag of traps down by the door and walked over to sit across from her. They ate in silence again, but it was a different silence. Comfortable. Known. Midway through the meal, she asked something unexpected. "Do you still speak with your people?" Ethan chewed, then swallowed. "I don't have people anymore. Family dead." Her gaze lingered, a profound empathy in her dark eyes. "Friends," he shook his head. "Not since the war." She didn't ask more, but she looked at him like she understood what that felt like. Not just to lose people, but to stop letting yourself want more. "I never had a brother," she said after a moment, her voice soft, reflective. "But I had a cousin, like a sister. She was taken. I looked for her for a year. Then they told me to stop. Said I was wasting food, wasting time." Ethan studied her face, a flicker of raw pain in her eyes. "Did you stop?" She didn't answer right away, her gaze distant, lost in memory. "My feet stopped, but not my mind." He nodded. He didn't say it out loud, but he respected that deeply. The rest of the day passed in routine. Willow spent hours repairing a tear in the lining of the coat, her fingers careful, almost reverent. Ethan worked on the lean-to outside, reinforcing it for the thaw. When he returned near dusk, she had washed the floors and cleaned out the old root bin beneath the stove. The cabin no longer felt like it belonged to just him. It had expanded, filled with a quiet, certain presence. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind returned, they shared the bed again without hesitation. No discussion, no ceremony. She climbed in beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. She whispered one thing, only once, just before sleep claimed her. "This time I choose who I belong to." Ethan didn't speak, but he held her close, fingers curling around her hand beneath the quilt. And this time he didn't let go. By the time March came, the snow began to rot. Thick patches of brown earth started breaking through along the hill's edge, and icicles dripped slow and steady from the eaves of the cabin. Mornings were still bitter, but by midday the wind felt less like a threat. The land hadn't softened yet, but it would. Inside the cabin, things had changed just as quietly. Ethan no longer set a second plate out for her. He set two automatically every meal. He no longer hesitated before placing his hand on her back as he passed behind her at the stove, a natural, comforting gesture. She no longer kept the quilt folded after rising. She left it rumpled, the impression of a body still visible in the bedding. That small act said more than words. They had crossed the threshold between survival and something else entirely. That morning, Ethan arose early. Willow was still asleep, one arm across his chest, her cheek warm against his shoulder. Her breath came even and slow, a soft, rhythmic comfort. His shirt had ridden up high on her thigh during the night, revealing smooth golden skin, the bare curve of her hip. The quilt had fallen halfway down. She didn't steer. He stayed there longer than usual, eyes tracing the lines of her face. The harsh cold had faded from her cheeks, replaced now with a softer flush. Her lips were no longer cracked. Her body had filled out again, stronger, not just in flesh, but in the way she moved, the way she met his gaze now. Her spirit was returning piece by piece, blooming in the warmth of safety. Eventually, he eased out of bed, careful not to wake her. He pulled on his clothes and boots and headed out. There were still fences to mend, traps to check. A dead limb needed clearing from the roof where the last storm had snapped it loose. An hour later, when he returned, the fire was up, coffee already warming. Willow had cleaned the basin and hung his shirts to dry over the lines strung near the stove. She wore her moccasins again, now patched with thread he didn't own, and a layered skirt she'd made from two of his old flannel shirts stitched together. The coat, once wrapped around her like armor, now hung openly over her shoulders, a symbol of her newfound security. The belt at her waist cinched it in, but she left the front loose, as if no longer afraid of being seen, of being herself. When he entered, she looked up briefly, her eyes acknowledging him, then returned to what she was doing, kneading dough at the table. Her sleeves rolled, her hair tied back in a tight braid. He crossed the room, poured coffee, then turned to her. "I'm going to town." She stopped, kneading, her hands still in the dough. Why, her voice held no suspicion, but it was the first time he'd mentioned leaving since she arrived. "I need salt, more seed, maybe new boots if I can find a decent pair." He met her gaze, a silent question in his eyes, and he added, his voice softening, I want to bring you something proper to wear. She straightened slowly, her expression unreadable. I don't need dresses. It's not about need, he said, stepping closer. It's about choice. She watched him a beat longer, her dark eyes searching his. Then her fingers returned to the dough, resuming their rhythmic work. I've never had a dress that was mine, she said quietly, a hint of vulnerability in her tone. Only hand-me-downs, what others didn't want. He stepped forward, reaching out to gently touch her hand, still dusted with flour. Then I'll make sure this one fits. She didn't smile, but she nodded once, a subtle tremor in her lips. That was enough. He left that afternoon, riding into Dry Hollow, a small half-forgotten settlement 2 hours south, tucked between canyon passes and old mining claims. He hadn't gone in over 3 months. He didn't want to linger. He bought what he came for: salt seed potatoes, nails, and a modest blue calico dress stitched by one of the widows near the church. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and knew the fabric soft to the touch. He returned before dusk. Willow met him at the edge of the cabin, brushing her hands on her skirt. Her eyes scanned the horse's saddlebag, but she didn't ask. Ethan handed her the paper-wrapped bundle. Here. She took it slowly, her fingers tracing the outline of the package, then peeled it open. Her breath caught a soft gasp. The blue was deep, almost midnight, with small white flowers printed across it. Simple but elegant, fitted at the waist, stitched carefully. Her fingers traced the bodice seams, a look of profound wonder on her face. I've never had anything like this, she said, her voice low, hushed with emotion. You do now. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with an unspoken question. Why? Ethan answered plainly, his gaze steady, earnest. Because you're not just surviving anymore. You're living. That night she wore it. She stood near the hearth, turning once slowly while he watched from the table. The dress hugged her curves perfectly, her waist, her hips, the way the neckline dipped just low enough to remind him what waited beneath it. But what struck him most was her face. She looked content, a quiet radiance emanating from her. She crossed to him slowly, the fire casting gold over her skin, the hem of the dress brushing her ankles. He stood. She reached for his hand, placed it against her waist, her touch warm and firm. I stayed because you didn't send me away, she said, her voice a soft murmur. But I wear this because now I know you want me here. I do, he said, simply, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned in then, and they kissed. Slow, deep, lingering, her lips warm, her hands tangling in his shirt. When they pulled apart, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm not afraid to be touched anymore. Ethan rested his forehead against her eyes, closed, a wave of profound relief washing over him. Then I won't rush it, he said, his voice a promise. And they stood like that together in the warm, quiet, dark, until the fire dimmed and the snow outside melted just a little more. By mid-April, the land had shifted. The snow was gone except for the deep shadows north of the ridge, and the ground had begun to breathe again. Dark soil breaking apart beneath boot heels, the scent of damp pine and wild sage clinging to the wind. Creeks were running high now, their waters rushing with the thaw. Coyotes barked at dusk, their calls echoing across the basin, and the silence that once filled Ethan's world had been replaced, not with noise, but with life. Willow stood near the barn that morning, sleeves rolled to her elbows, tugging a coil of rope tight over the newly patched rail. She wore the blue calico dress still, though it was dusted with dirt from kneeling in the garden bed earlier. Her braids swung over one shoulder, loose strands sticking to her neck with sweat. The dress had become hers, not something gifted, not something borrowed. It belonged to her now, and so did her place on this land, a root firmly planted. Inside the cabin, the windows were open, letting in the fresh, cool air. Ethan had just returned from checking the creek line traps and was laying out fresh pelts on the bench near the stove. When he glanced up and saw her through the open door, hammer in hand, adjusting the hinge on the gate, something in his chest tightened. Not with worry, not with desire, but with a strange and humbling peace, a sense of completeness he hadn't known he was missing. He stepped out and walked to her side. She didn't flinch, didn't stop working. You fixed it, he asked, a hint of admiration in his voice. I did, she said without looking up. You ever do carpentry before? Watched my uncle. He built homes with river stone. I carried nails, she said, a half smirk playing on her lips. He nodded, a soft chuckle escaping him. You want to do more of it? She looked over, her eyes meeting his, a serious expression settling on her face. Do you want help? I do, he said, his voice firm, sincere. Not just with chores. She didn't answer right away, just rested the hammer down, her body angled slightly toward him, a subtle shift in her posture that spoke volumes. Then, almost out of nowhere, her voice dropped, hushed, laden with a truth she had held close. There's something I didn't tell you. Ethan didn't move, didn't press. He simply waited, his gaze unwavering. I lied about not being chaste. She looked at him straight now, her eyes holding a flicker of past fear now tempered by trust. There were men, 2 white men and 1 half-blood scout. They saw me leave the southern canyon. They followed for a day, but I crossed the river and left no tracks. They were trappers, the kind who take Apache women when no one watches. Ethan's jaw clenched slightly, a muscle twitching in his cheek. A cold fury long dormant stirred within him. They hurt you? No, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Not then. I ran. She swallowed her throat tight with memory. But if they come this far north... They won't, he said, his voice firm, resolute, a steel-edged promise. Not to this basin. Not with me here. She studied him for a moment, her dark eyes searching his, then nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. I believe that. They returned to work without more words. But something had shifted, some final barrier between them now broken. She had trusted him with the full truth, and he had stayed standing, his presence a fortress against the shadows of her past. That night Willow took his hand and pulled him to the table after dinner. A scrap of old cloth had been spread out like a cover, and in the center was something small gleaming faintly. A ring, simple, made of copper wire, shaped and twisted carefully. I found it in your chest of tools, she said, her voice soft. It wasn't finished. He recognized it instantly. Years ago he had tried to shape it during the last winter. Marie had been alive. It had never been for her. It had been something he fiddled with during long nights of snow and silence, a restless energy finding an outlet. He never wore it. You made it fit me, he said, looking down at her hands, so capable, so strong. I did, she replied, her gaze unwavering. Because I belong here. If you want it, he took the ring, his fingers closing around the cold metal, and looked at her face. Serious, strong, patient, a woman who knew her own mind and heart. I do, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't cry. She didn't smile broadly. She simply stood and let him slip the ring onto her finger, then reached up and kissed him slowly without urgency, a tender, solemn promise. Later they lay in bed, her back to his chest, his arm across her stomach, his hand resting just below her navel. If I carry, she said softly, her voice a mere breath, will know soon. His hand didn't move, but his grip tightened just enough to tell her he'd stay either way. Outside the wind shifted. The night settled quiet and nothing felt missing anymore. The days grew longer. By late April, the last frost had lifted from the earth and the basin turned soft with new growth. Low grass pushed up in patches of vibrant green against the brown soil, and buds formed on the cottonwoods near the creek, promising lush shade. Ethan had begun planting again, beans, squash, corn. Nothing fancy, but enough to get through another winter. And now, for the first time in years, he planted twice as much. Willow worked beside him every day. She had taken ownership of the garden plot like it was hers from the beginning. She arranged the rows with stones, marked the seedlings with carved twigs, and hummed softly. While she worked, always the same few notes, a low melodic repetition. He never asked what they meant. It didn't matter. Her voice, that quiet hum, had become part of the land, now part of the rhythm of their new life. Inside the cabin, the changes were quiet but unmistakable. Her stitching now lined most of the clothes hanging from the pegs. 2 handmade blankets had been added to the bed, their patterns simple but warm. She'd organized the kitchen shelves, her touch bringing order to the utilitarian space. And she'd tanned one of the deer hides into a soft mat that now lay under the table, a luxurious comfort. She never asked permission. She never explained. She simply did. And Ethan never stopped her. One morning she paused while kneeling in the soil and pressed a hand to her belly. She stood slowly, leaning on the spade, her face unreadable, a stillness about her that drew his immediate attention. Ethan was by her side in 2 long strides. What is it? She didn't answer at first, just looked up at him, her eyes shaded by loose strands of hair falling across her cheeks. Then, without fear, her voice a quiet, profound statement, she said, I haven't bled in over 5 weeks. Ethan didn't move. The world didn't change. The wind kept blowing, but inside his chest something shifted, a profound tremor of hope and disbelief. You think it's... He didn't finish the sentence, the words catching in his throat. I don't know, she said honestly, her gaze steady, searching his. But I've never made it this far before. He didn't say anything more, just reached for her hand, held it tight, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. They didn't speak of it again that day, but he watched her more closely. How she moved slower, paused, more often rested her hand on her stomach when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't speak his hope aloud. Neither did she, but it was there humming between them, a fragile, beautiful possibility. Later that week, a rider came. It was the first visitor to the basin in over 4 months. Ethan had been down by the creek splitting a fallen limb when he heard hooves. He reached for his rifle by instinct, quiet, smooth, and stepped into the open with his hat low over his brow. The man was alone, young, nervous, and didn't dismount. "You Ridge," the rider called, his voice thin in the vast silence. Ethan gave a short nod. "I passed a woman near the southern canyon some months back. Apache, looked rough, barefoot. She's still with you?" Ethan's shoulders stiffened, a cold dread coiling in his gut. "Why?" The man hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. "Just some fella's been asking. Traders out of Mohawk Ridge said they had claim on her." "She wasn't claimed," Ethan said flatly, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "She's here with me now." The rider seemed to weigh something, his gaze flickering between Ethan's face and the rifle in his hand. Then he nodded once. "I didn't tell them where I saw her," he said, his voice softer, a hint of respect. "Didn't feel right." Ethan's grip on the rifle eased a fraction, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "Appreciate that. You want me to send word back?" Ethan took a step forward until the horse shifted nervously. "Tell them. If anyone comes looking for her," he said, his voice low, steady, imbued with an unyielding threat. "They'll find nothing left standing but the wind." The rider nodded again, tipped his hat, and turned the horse around without another word, disappearing back the way he came. That evening, Ethan told Willow. She listened without panic, her eyes never leaving his face, absorbing every word, every nuance. "They'll come?" she asked, her voice calm, almost detached. "Maybe," he said, taking her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "But not soon and not prepared." She was silent for a long time, her gaze distant, as if seeing something beyond the cabin walls. Then her eyes met his, filled with a fierce resolve. "Then if I give birth to a child, they'll know I belonged here. They'll know I was not taken." "You don't have to prove anything," he said, his heart aching with the depth of her determination. "I know," she said, her voice firm. "But I will." That night she undressed slowly, not rushed, not coy. She let the blue dress fall to her feet and walked to him, wearing nothing but her moccasins and the copper ring on her finger. She lay down beside him and pressed his hand to her belly. "I want you to feel it now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, with a new profound joy. His hand didn't move. He just breathed, then leaned down and kissed her. The slowest, softest kiss he'd given her, yet a tender acknowledgement of the life growing within her, of the future they were building. She kissed him back like it was a promise, a sacred vow. That night they made love for the first time, not out of survival, not out of need, but because they'd stayed, because they chose each other completely, freely, irrevocably. And in the dark silence of the room, nothing was broken anymore. By mid-May, the basin had turned green. Fresh grass blanketed the hillside behind the cabin, bending in the breeze like low tide. The cottonwoods along the creek had burst fully into leaf, casting dappled shadows on the water, and bees hummed over early blooms Willow had coaxed from the soil near the porch. The land no longer looked like the place she'd nearly died in. It looked like it had been waiting for her to return, to breathe life back into its quiet corners. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer now, windows cracked open during the day, curtains lifting with each soft gust. The scent of fresh bread mixed with pine smoke, a comforting domestic aroma. Everything in the small space bore her touch. Ethan had built the walls, but she had filled them with life, with warmth, with a sense of belonging. Willow moved differently these days. Slower, her balance shifted slightly as she worked her hands, brushing her belly more often now. There was no more doubt. She was pregnant. Not a hope, not a guess. A quiet truth growing stronger every day. They didn't speak of it in dramatic terms. There were no grand celebrations, no sudden tears, just a quiet meal shared under candlelight. Her hand on her belly, his hand over hers, a not a kiss. Then back to routine, a routine now imbued with a deeper meaning. One morning, Ethan stepped out to fetch water and found her seated on the porch steps. She was wrapped in the coat he'd first given her, the same coat she nearly froze in, the same coat he hadn't worn since. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, catching the pale morning light. She looked up as he approached, her eyes reflecting the same steady fire that had been there the first time they met, a quiet strength that had only deepened. "They are not coming," she said softly, as if reading the question he hadn't voiced aloud since the rider passed through weeks ago. Ethan sat beside her, the wood creaking under his weight. "No, they are not." "You still keep your rifle loaded?" she asked, glancing towards the cabin door. "Always," she nodded. "Good." He watched her for a moment, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. Then finally he spoke, what had been sitting in the back of his mind for weeks, a question that held the weight of their shared future. "You ever want to leave this place, go farther north, closer to town?" She shook her head slowly, her gaze sweeping across the land. Her land. This is my land now. Not because I own it, but because I live through it. I'm not starting over again. He looked out across the field. The beans were sprouting. The fence was solid. The cabin had held through winter. Everything he needed was right here. So was everything he didn't know he needed until her. Later that day, Ethan went through the old chest in the corner, the one with a broken latch he never got around to fixing. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small silver chain, something that had once belonged to his mother. He'd forgotten it was even there. When he handed it to Willow later, she didn't say anything for a long while, her fingers tracing the delicate links, a profound emotion in her eyes. Then she reached for his face, kissed him softly, and said, "I will wear this the day we say vows." He frowned, a slight confusion on his face. "We haven't said vows." She raised a brow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You gave me food. You gave me warmth. But you never asked me to be your wife. I didn't think I had to." "You don't," she said, her smile widening, a rare, radiant sight. "But I want you to." So that evening, as dusk colored the hills in gold, he took her hand on the front porch and spoke the words plain and clear, his voice resonating with a deep, abiding love. "Willow, I want you as my wife. Not out of obligation, not out of rescue. I want you because you stayed, and I stayed, and that's all I'll ever need." Willow's hand pressed against his warm and firm, a silent affirmation. "Then I am yours." She placed the copper ring he once gave her back on his palm, then slid it onto her finger again slowly. This time her eyes locked on his, a profound understanding passing between them. Inside the cabin that night, as the oil lamp flickered and the wind sighed softly through the trees, she curled into him under the quilt, her belly now firm between them. He rested his hand there just as he had that first night, a protective, loving gesture. She nestled closer, her breath soft against his chest. He spoke only once more, his voice a low, heartfelt whisper. "You're not what I saved." She looked up, puzzled, her dark eyes searching his. He kissed her forehead, a tender, lingering touch. "You're what saved me." She closed her eyes, then not because she was tired, but because she finally felt safe enough to sleep, completely, utterly safe. And outside, spring pressed against the window panes, a promise of new life. No one came. No one ever would, because they had already found everything worth keeping. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.